The babysitter. Samantha was nervous as she knocked on the door of the large, suburban home. She was just a teenager, and this was her first time babysitting for a family she didn't know. But the parents seemed nice enough on the phone, and the money was good. The little girl, Emily, was sweet and easy to take care of. She showed Samantha her room and all her toys, and then settled down to watch a movie. Samantha sat on the couch, keeping an eye on her charge while scrolling through her phone. As the movie ended, Emily went to bed, and Samantha was left alone in the house. She tried to shake off the eerie feeling she had, but it was hard. The house was too quiet, too dark. She decided to take a walk around the house to get to know it better and maybe shake off the feeling. She started in the living room, peeking into the kitchen, and then the dining room. Everything was in its place, not a single thing out of order. She climbed the stairs to the second floor, peeking into the bedrooms. All was silent and still. She went to the last room, the master bedroom, and as she opened the door, a chill ran down her spine. The room was empty, nothing out of the ordinary, but she couldn't shake off the feeling that someone was watching her. Samantha quickly retreated back to the living room, and sat down on the couch. She tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but it was persistent. She heard strange noises, like footsteps and whispers, coming from all around her. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, but the noises were getting louder and closer. Suddenly, she saw a figure standing in the doorway, and she froze in fear. But as she looked closer, she realized it was just a coat rack with a coat hanging on it. She breathed a sigh of relief, but her heart was still racing. She decided to stay up the rest of the night, too scared to sleep. When the parents returned, they found her wide-eyed and pale, and she quit the job on the spot. From that day on, she never babysat again. The experience of that night was too much for her to handle. The cabin. It had been a long week for the group of friends, and they were looking forward to a weekend getaway in the woods. They rented a remote cabin, nestled deep in the forest, and set off early Friday morning. As they arrived, they were greeted with the beautiful scenery. The cabin was surrounded by tall trees, and a small stream flowed nearby. They quickly settled in, and started to explore the area around the cabin. The first night was uneventful. They cooked dinner together, played games and went to bed early, tired from the long drive. But as the night progressed, strange noises started to wake them up. They heard footsteps, whispering, and even screams coming from outside. They tried to ignore it, thinking it was just animals, but the noises persisted. The next day, they decided to explore the area around the cabin, hoping to find an explanation for the strange noises. They found an old well and an abandoned mine, but nothing that could explain the sounds they heard. As they returned to the cabin, they found that something had been left on the porch. It was a note that read, "You should have never come here." They were terrified and decided to pack up and leave immediately. But as they were leaving, they found that the car wouldn't start, and their phones had no signal. They were stranded, and the only thing they could do was to stay in the cabin and wait for help. That night, the noises were louder and closer than ever before. They could hear someone walking around the cabin, and they could see shadows moving in the windows. They huddled together, too scared to move, and waited for daylight. In the morning, they finally got a hold of someone to come and rescue them, but as they were leaving, they found that the cabin was burned to the ground. They never knew what happened, but they knew one thing for sure: they never wanted to go back to that cabin again. The doll. When Sarah received the old doll from her grandmother, she didn't think much of it. It was just an old toy, dusty and worn with age. But as she began to play with it, she started to notice that the doll seemed to have a life of its own. At first, it was just small things, like the doll's eyes seemed to follow her around the room. But then, strange things began to happen. The doll would move on its own, and she could hear whispering coming from it. Sarah tried to shake off the feeling that the doll was somehow alive, but it was hard. One night, Sarah had a nightmare where the doll came to life and attacked her. She woke up in a cold sweat, and as she looked around the room, she saw the doll sitting on her dresser, staring at her with its lifeless eyes. Sarah decided to do some research on the doll, and she found out that it had a tragic past. It was made by a woman who lost her child and put all her grief and love into the doll. The doll was passed down through generations, and each person who owned it met with some sort of tragedy. Sarah realized that the doll was connected to a tragic event from the past, and it was haunted by the spirit of the woman's child. She knew she had to get rid of the doll before it was too late. She took the doll to the park and left it on a bench, hoping that someone would find it and take it away. She never saw the doll again, but she always felt like it was watching her, and she never forgot the feeling of being watched. From that day on, Sarah never wanted to have anything to do with dolls again. The experience was too much for her to handle. She couldn't shake off the feeling that the doll was still watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. The subway. It was a typical late-night ride on the subway for John. He was on his way home from work, and the train was almost empty. As the train was moving through the dark tunnel, the lights suddenly flickered and the train came to a sudden stop. John looked around, confused, but there was no announcement, no explanation for why the train had stopped. He could hear strange noises, like whispers and footsteps, coming from all around him. He tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but it was persistent. As the lights flickered again, he saw ghostly figures standing in the corner of the train car. They were transparent and seemed to be staring at him. John was frozen with fear, and he could feel his heart racing. He tried to call for help, but his phone had no signal. He was trapped in the train car with the ghostly figures, and there was no way out. He could feel the train shaking and he knew that something bad was going to happen. Suddenly, the door of the train car opened, and a figure stepped in. It was the conductor, who had come to check on the passengers. John tried to tell him about the ghostly figures, but the conductor looked at him with a blank stare, and told him there was no one else on the train. John was relieved to get off the train and back to the safety of his home, but he couldn't shake off the feeling that he had experienced something supernatural. He never rode the subway alone again. The experience was too much for him to handle. He couldn't shake off the feeling that the ghostly figures were still watching him, waiting for him to take the subway again. The hotel room. When Mark and his wife, Lisa, checked into their hotel room for the night, they were looking forward to a romantic getaway. But as they settled in, they soon realized that they were not alone. The room was haunted by the ghost of a previous guest who had died in the room, and the couple must find a way to escape before the ghost claims them as its next victims. Mark and Lisa began to hear strange noises coming from the walls, and they could see shadows moving in the corners of the room. They tried to ignore it, thinking it was just their imagination, but the noises persisted. One night, as they were getting ready for bed, the ghostly figure of a man appeared in the room. He was transparent and seemed to be staring at them with a menacing look. The couple was paralyzed with fear, and they could feel their hearts racing. They tried to call for help, but their phone had no signal. They were trapped in the room with the ghost, and there was no way out. They could hear the ghostly figure moving around the room, and they knew that it was only a matter of time before it would attack them. They decided to try and escape through the window, but they found that it was locked and wouldn't budge. They were trapped, and they knew that they had to do something before it was too late. Mark remembered reading about a ritual to banish ghosts, and he quickly gathered the necessary items. He lit a candle, and began to recite the incantation. As he finished, the ghostly figure disappeared and the room was quiet once again. The couple quickly gathered their things and left the hotel, never looking back. They knew that they had to put that night behind them, but the memory of the ghost would stay with them forever.